Imagine you're on a train, right? It's Tuesday, everything seems normal, just the usual sounds, the wheels on the tracks, and then suddenly gunfire erupts. That's the horrifying reality that passengers on the Jaffar Express in Balochistan, Pakistan, faced earlier this week.
Yeah, it's a truly shocking incident. And in this deep dive, we're not just going to tell you what happened. We're going to try to go deeper. We want to understand what this event means, who the players are in this complex situation, and why this specific attack matters so much in the bigger picture. We're going to be relying primarily on breaking news reports to try to piece everything together for you.
So let's get right into it, like you said. First things first, when and where exactly did this attack take place?
Okay, so the attack happened on Tuesday in Balochistan province, Pakistan. The target was the Jaffar Express train. It was traveling from Quetta to Peshawar. And the attack, according to reports, happened at a very specific spot on the railway line between the stations of Gudalar and Piru Kanari. Now, this stretch of track is known for its challenging terrain. It goes through a series of tunnels. And this attack, it seems, took place inside one of those tunnels, tunnel number 8. To be precise.
A tunnel. Wow.
Yeah.
That just adds another layer of, I don't know, a feeling of vulnerability to the whole situation.
Absolutely. Being trapped in a tunnel during an attack, I can't even imagine.
So what was the immediate impact of this attack for the people on board?
Well, it must have been absolutely terrifying. I mean, just picture it, the sudden gunfire, the train probably shaking, people screaming, utter chaos. Tragically, there were injuries reported right away, including the train driver being injured.
That's awful. And as often happens in these situations, it wasn't long before a group came forward claiming responsibility.
Right. Fairly soon after the news broke, the Baloch Liberation Army, or BLA, released a statement saying they were behind the attack. The BLA is a separatist organization that has been active in the region for a long time.
And what exactly did they claim in that statement? I remember reading it, and it seemed pretty detailed.
Their claims were pretty bold, yeah. They didn't just say they fired on the train, they said they actually derailed it. And they claimed they killed 6 security personnel who they said were on board the train. But the most disturbing part of their statement, I think, was that they claimed to have taken over 100 passengers hostage. And they specifically mentioned that some of these hostages were active-duty military personnel.
Taking hostages, especially military personnel, that would definitely raise the stakes. And didn't they also issue a very serious warning along with those claims?
They did. The BLA warned the Pakistan military that if they launched any kind of operation to rescue the hostages, they would execute them. It's a classic tactic to try to deter any quick or forceful response from the authorities.
But we have to remember, right, that all of this is coming from the BLA. We haven't seen any independent confirmation of most of these details.
Exactly. It's really important to be cautious about accepting these claims at face value. Unfortunately, groups like the BLA sometimes exaggerate their actions for propaganda purposes. We really need to see independent verification from reliable sources before we can say for sure how many casualties there were, how many hostages there might be, and so on.
So putting those unverified claims aside for a moment, what do we know for sure? What information has been confirmed by more official sources?
Well, Pakistan Railways has confirmed that there were around 500 passengers on board the Jaffar Express when the attack happened, and tragically, a significant number of those passengers were women and children. This really highlights the indiscriminate nature of this attack, targeting civilians.
Yeah, it's a grim reminder that innocent people are often caught in the middle of these conflicts.
Absolutely. And we also know, going back to what we were talking about earlier with the tunnels, that the railway line in this area is in very difficult mountainous terrain. It's not just tunnels, it's just a generally hard to reach area. And this kind of terrain obviously would make it very difficult to carry out an attack, but it also makes any kind of rescue or security operation that much more challenging.
Makes sense. And what about the actual attack itself? Do we have a sense of how intense the firing was, what it must have sounded like?
Well, eyewitness accounts from the passengers and early reports from security sources seem to back up what the BLA said about there being intense firing directed at the train. So this wasn't just a small-scale incident. It sounds like it was a very deliberate and sustained attack.
And how did the authorities react? What was the initial response to the attack?
The Balochistan provincial government acted pretty quickly. They declared a state of emergency in the area, and they immediately dispatched security forces and rescue teams to the site of the attack. They also put hospitals in the nearby city of Sibi on high alert, just in case they needed to treat a large number of casualties.
That sounds like a pretty standard and necessary response in a situation like this. Did the national government also make a statement?
Yeah, they did. Pakistan's Interior Minister, Mohsin Naqvi, very strongly condemned the attack, basically denouncing the people who would target innocent civilians like this. His statement seems to show that the government is ready to respond forcefully, but it also shows how hard it is for them to deal with this ongoing violence in Balochistan.
And like we said before, this attack didn't just come out of nowhere. Balochistan has been dealing with instability for a long time now. So can you give us some more context about the root causes of the conflict in the region?
Sure. Balochistan has been a really volatile region for decades. It's been plagued by separatist movements, and the BLA is a key player in this. They emerged as part of a long-running movement for greater autonomy or even independence for the Baloch people. They cite historical grievances related to things like resource distribution, political representation, and basically feeling marginalized by the central government.
So when the BLA targets infrastructure like the Jaffar Express and claims to be taking hostages, it's not just random acts of violence. There's a specific strategy behind it, right?
Exactly. It's a tactic meant to disrupt the government's control, draw international attention to their cause, and put pressure on the authorities. And it's important to note that the BLA's targets aren't always just local or national. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, seems to be a particular focus for them.
CPEC. That massive infrastructure project that's supposed to connect China and Pakistan through Balochistan. Why is it such a point of contention?
Well, the BLA and other separatist groups, they see CPEC as basically an exploitative project. They believe it benefits the central government and China more than it benefits the local Baloch people. And they feel like Balochistan's resources are being taken advantage of without their consent or any real benefits for them.
So, even though CPEC is presented as this big development project that's supposed to bring prosperity, it's actually fueling resentment and conflict.
Yeah, it's a complex issue. It really highlights the disconnect between the government's vision for development and the aspirations of at least a segment of the Baloch population. It makes you think about whose interests are truly being served by these kinds of projects and whether top-down development really works in conflict zones.
It's also worth pointing out, right, that attacks on railway lines in Balochistan aren't new.
You're absolutely right. Sadly, this isn't the first time Baloch militant groups have targeted railway infrastructure. They've used tactics like rocket attacks and planting bombs along the tracks to try to derail trains.
Oh.
This attack on the Jaffar Express, while it's particularly shocking because of its scale and the hostage situation, it unfortunately fits into a larger pattern of these kinds of actions in the region.
And this attack happened not long after the Quetta-Peshawar train service was restored, right? It was suspended for a while because of security concerns.
Yeah, the service had only been restored recently after being suspended for over a month due to those very concerns, the fear of attacks. So this recent attack is a harsh reminder of just how fragile the situation is. It really underlines the cyclical nature of this conflict, the fact that it keeps flaring up.
So, stepping back a bit, looking at the bigger picture, what does this attack tell us about the security situation in the region beyond just Balochistan itself?
Well, this attack is part of a concerning trend. There's been a noticeable increase in terrorist activities in Balochistan over the past year or so. And it's not just isolated incidents. It seems like there's a real escalation happening. Remember that suicide bombing at the Quetta railway station last November? That attack killed 26 people and injured over 60. That's just one example of the rising violence in the region.
And Balochistan's location, right, bordering Iran and Afghanistan, that can't be helping the situation.
Absolutely. Balochistan's geography is another major factor here. It shares long borders with both Iran and Afghanistan, and those borders are often porous, meaning it's hard to control who and what crosses them. This allows for the movement of militant groups and weapons, which makes it much harder for Pakistan's security forces to keep things under control.
So far, we've been talking about the political and security side of things. But what about the human impact? What's it like for the people living in Balochistan constantly facing this threat of violence?
For the people living there, it's a constant cycle of fear and insecurity. Their daily lives are overshadowed by the possibility of violence. Things that many of us take for granted, like commuting to work, visiting families, sending kids to school, these things become really dangerous for them. Imagine the fear those families on the train must have felt, trapped in that tunnel with gunfire all around them. It really brings home the human cost of this conflict. It's easy to forget that when you're just reading news reports.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder.
Yeah.
So, given everything that's happened, what do you think is going to happen next?
Well, the most likely immediate response from the Pakistani authorities will be a major security operation to find and arrest the people responsible for the attack. But because the BLA claims to have taken hostages, this operation is going to be very delicate and very dangerous. And sadly, based on what we've seen in the past, there's a real risk that the situation could actually get worse before it gets better.
Right. And the immediate focus will be on hostages, I assume.
Yeah, the top priority will be ensuring the safety of any remaining passengers, getting medical help to those who were injured, and then conducting a thorough investigation to figure out exactly how this attack was planned and carried out. They need to understand if there were any security lapses that allowed this to happen, so they can try to prevent it from happening again.
So to wrap this up for you, we've delved deep into a horrific attack on a passenger train in a region with a long and tragic history of conflict. We looked at the claims made by the BLA, but also stressed how important it is to verify those claims. We explored the broader context that makes this attack part of a much larger issue, and it seems likely that this event is going to trigger even more security operations in the region.
It all points to something much bigger. This attack reveals the complex mix of local grievances, regional politics, and just the huge challenges of maintaining peace and security in a place like Balochistan. And it really makes you think, what are the long-term consequences of all this violence, not just for the region as a whole, but for the everyday people caught in the middle of it? What does it mean for their future?
It's a question worth pondering.
Absolutely.
Thanks for taking us through this.
You're welcome.
That's it for this deep dive. We'll be back next week with a new episode.
See you then.